Luke 16, verses 1 through 13 read as follows. Jesus said to the disciples, "There was a rich man who had a manager, and charges were brought to him that this man was wasting his possessions. And he called him and said to him, 'What is this I hear about you? Turn in the account of your management, for you can no longer be manager.' And the manager said to himself, 'What shall I do, since my master is taking the management away from me? I am not strong enough to dig, and I am ashamed to beg. I've decided what to do, so that when I am removed from management, people may receive me into their houses.' So summoning his master's debtors one by one, he said to the first, 'How much do you owe my master?' He said, 100 measures of oil. The manager then said to him, 'Take your bill and sit down quickly and write 50. Then he said to another, 'And how much do you owe?' He said, 100 measures of wheat. The manager said to him, 'Take your bill and write 80. The master commended the dishonest manager for his shrewdness. For the sons of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than the sons of light. And I tell you, make friends for yourself by means of unrighteous wealth, so that when it fails, they may receive you into the eternal dwellings. One who is faithful in a very little is also faithful in much, and one who is dishonest in a very little is also dishonest in much. If then you have not been faithful in the unrighteous wealth, who will entrust you to true riches? And if you have not been faithful in that which is another, who will give you that which is your own? No one can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money." The word of the Lord. Welcome to another week of Oratio. This week we're looking at Luke 16, which in its title even is kind of confusing, because it puts up the dishonest manager as dishonest, right, which he was, but it already puts us in a place as the reader as someone ready to judge him, ready to say that this is the person in the wrong, that the parable must be about what he's done wrong. And yet, and I guess this is actually a title from the particular Bible I'm using, so that's the bias of titles too. But it does say that he was dishonest, and we don't know if that's true or not. In the story, it doesn't say that this had been proven. It just says that people had been saying he was dishonest, and so the master was going or did fire him. And the manager then, coming from a place of having very little, decides to do what? To save his skin, to figure out how he's going to survive, and not having a financial place of security, he starts forgiving people of their debts to his master. He starts pulling people in and saying, "What do you owe? Let's cut that in half, or, take 20 off of that." And you would think that the fact that he was forgiving his master's debts, the debts that people owed his master, that his master would be completely pissed. But you see at the end that the master commends the manager for his shrewdness, for his wiseness, for his wisdom in figuring out how to do with very little, how to be faithful with the little he had, the little power he had, the little ability he had, the little financial stability he had to secure something for himself. And what he secured for himself was community, was the ability to find stability in community, not in money. And in fact, the master says, "Good job. That was smart." And in fact, Jesus wraps up the parable by saying one who is faithful with very little, as in the dishonest manager who had very little, one who is faithful in focusing on grace and forgiveness and mercy for others, even though he was watching out for himself. That's clearly a part of what's happening. He's trying to secure his place in the world after not having a job. And yet his intention is, I know where I can find my stability. It's not in money. It's in the community around me. And in fact, Jesus ends by saying you cannot serve both God and money, and he knows who's listening. The religious leaders of the day who put their status, who put their everything in the way that their religion, that the law, and that their money protects them. He knows that those religious leaders are listening. And in fact, in the beginning of the next verse, it says, the Pharisees, who were lovers of money, heard all these things, and they ridiculed him. Jesus and the dishonest manager here in the parable were all about flipping hierarchies. They were about putting the poor in power, giving the sex worker a place of dignity, and criticizing the religious leaders. That's the story of Luke as a gospel, is about flipping hierarchies. That's the story of Jesus' ministry as a whole. The last will be first. And in fact, the dishonest manager is faithful in forgiving debt, in creating community from the little that he had to work with. And even the master himself, clearly not centering money in the way that our capitalistic system would, and would punish, right, the dishonest manager for forgiving debt that wasn't his to forgive. Jesus and the master in the story say, good job. You do better than the quote-unquote children of light in this generation, than the religious leaders, than those handing out judgment calls instead of forgiveness. And in fact, we see this with the story that precedes it, the parable that Jesus just finished telling. There's a series of parables that are happening, and the parable right before this was the one of the prodigal son. A kid who goes off, squanders the wealth of their parent, which was already very disrespectful. I'm sure we've heard this before. And then comes back and says, I'm sorry, I messed up. Forgive me. And the person in power does. Their parent does. And in fact, celebrates. This forgiveness celebrates the grace, celebrates the turning from and the coming back, with a party, with a celebration, with community surrounding the son, the kid, the daughter that was lost, that came back. And so we see in this parable of the quote-unquote dishonest manager that the central theme that Jesus is focusing on is, one, wealth isn't the point. It's not your God, and it cannot be. If you serve it, if you center it, you are not centering God's kingdom, which flips hierarchies, which puts the people in power lower, which lifts up the marginalized and the oppressed and those with very little. It lifts them to the top. The first shall be last, and the last shall be first. We see that Jesus is saying one who is faithful in very little will be faithful in a lot. He's saying that, look, even if you mess up at the beginning, even if this manager didn't handle the master's finances well, even if you mess up in the beginning, be faithful in very little, in the very little that you have. Be faithful in forgiveness. Be faithful in grace. Be faithful in centering your community, in centering other people instead of money, instead of power. Be faithful in very little. This man didn't have very much to work with, but what he did have, he used to forgive other people's debts. And again, yes, part of it was for his own self-protection, because he was about to be without a job. But again, Jesus' central message is that the stability that you are looking for will not be found in finances, even a job, but in the community around you. And it doesn't negate the importance of money in a system, in a world that centers it. But God says that is not where your community, where your wholeness, where forgiveness and truth can be found and grown. That is only in community that is radically forgiving and radically full of grace for each other. And so when I was reading over this passage, being sort of confused about it, especially initially, I was thinking, okay, the guy messed up, and then he started forgiving people. And then it goes, one who is faithful in very little will be faithful in a lot. Almost saying that the dishonest manager is the faithful one, as I came to that conclusion in the end. And so what it made me think is not that the dishonest manager is the bad guy in the story, but in fact, that the way we show our faithfulness, even if we've messed up in big ways, is we start showing up in small ways. We start bringing ourselves to the table in increments and in ways that we can commit to for each other and ourselves. What is a small way that we can show up for our community this week, that we can be faithful to black and brown bodies that are on the line? What is one small way this week that we can be faithful to the black trans women that are being killed? What is one small step we can take to say, yes, I am faithful in this? Even if I've messed up big other times, even if I haven't shown up to an event or shown up for a friend when I should have, what is one way I can be faithful to my community this week? Because those that can be faithful in very little will be faithful in a lot more. When you start showing up, even in the smallest steps, with whatever little you have, God meets you, the divine meets you and says, well done. The small steps are big steps. What is a way that you can be faithful to your own well-being this week? What is a way that you can show up for yourself in small steps? Do you need a nap? Do you need a snack? Have you eaten today? What is your body telling you? What does your mind need? Rest, silence, stillness, solitude. What do you need? Take a small step for yourself this week. Small increments turn into big things, and you matter. You and your community and the health of both of you matters. One who is faithful in a very little is also faithful in much. Friends, this week I encourage you to show up in whatever small way you can with forgiveness, with grace, with presence for yourself and for your community. Make one choice. Read an article, send a friend a text, educate yourself to be a better advocate for others, to amplify the call of others who are in pain, who are in danger, and educate and advocate for yourself too. When I made a bad decision in terms of a friendship, I was not a faithful friend. I made a mistake, and I grieved the mistake that I made. I grieved that I had failed in my faithfulness. And I was no longer in the position of a friend anymore. I lost my position. And I grieved it. And I felt the weight of the consequence of what I did. And then what I did was I decided to start showing up for other friends that I was still in the position of friend. And I decided to show up in small ways and keep doing the next right thing in those friendships. Though I had been unfaithful in one friendship, I decided to keep showing up in small ways for the friends and the community I still had around me, because we are all going to mess up. And it's going to hurt, and there are going to be consequences, and yet one who is faithful with very little will then be faithful with much more. It all starts in small steps. Be faithful to your community, to your relationships, to your friendships, in small increments, even if you've messed up. And be faithful to yourself, even if you've neglected your body, your mind, your health. One who's faithful with very little will be faithful with much more. So friends, take the little that you have and show up for yourself. Make one decision this week to show up for yourself, for your body, for your mind. One thing you can do, write it down, and pick one thing you can do for your community. Read an article, show up to an event. Show up, be faithful. If it starts small, that's okay. That's the way it has to start. Be well and be faithful. Go in peace.